I'm really excited about the event tonight. We have like a really amazing showcase and mix of visual artists, musicians, writers, researchers, scholars. Um, and our moderator tonight is the wonderful Muna Mire. Give it up. Muna is like a quadruple threat. I could list all the things they're good at for like a day. They recently started working at The Rundown with Robin Thede, which is a new late night comedy show on BET. And they do fact checking, but they're also writing all the best jokes on the show. So remember that when you watch the show. Muna is also, as many of you already know, an incredibly talented writer and thinker. Their work can be found in the New York Times Magazine, Teen Vogue, The New Republic, Mask, where they were an editor, The Nation, where they reported on Ferguson as an intern, and Vice. They have a really good Twitter account that I hope you all follow. And they're going to be moderating tonight, and they're also going to read a little bit from their piece, which is called Towards a Black Muslim Ontology of Resistance. Here's Muna Mire. Give it up. Oh, and they wanted me to say that they're Somali.
That's right. Thank you. Okay. So I'm just going to jump right into reading from this piece. It's an essay that I wrote for the New Inquiry a year and some change ago, I think. And it's very relevant to a lot of what we'll be talking about tonight, I think. As Black folks, we are in practice not a part of the larger community of Muslims. We are allowed to practice, but we don't share deen with the Ummah. America is home to the most racially diverse group of Muslims in the world, but the community is segregated. What does it mean to be seen as Muslim, as a legitimate believer? Whatever the answer, in the eyes of many US Muslims today, it's negated by Blackness. Black Muslims are a contradiction in terms. Invisible despite being the foundation for the faith in this country. Black Muslims are not seen as true Muslims. And that is the moral equivocation that legitimizes and props up all manner of anti-Black racism in the American Muslim community today. Black people are not seen as viable potential partners in Muslim faith or love. Black families are not accepted into Muslim faith communities outside of their own. State violence against Black Muslims is not acknowledged or used to mobilize movements the way that violence against non-Black Muslims does. One has to ask, does Black life matter to the Muslim community? Is the Muslim community aware of the structural impacts of anti-Black racism in America? The very idea of a larger, coherent Muslim community is thrown into question when we confront cultural rifts as deep, wide, and painful as these. The public perception of Muslims, particularly since the faith was thrust into the spotlight post 9/11, remains riddled with misconceptions. Racist stereotypes external to the Muslim community dictate that Americans still think of Muslims as brown, bearded men. As recently as the white supremacist massacre at a Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, the conflation of Sikh men who wear turbans with Muslims has had deadly consequences. And this has obviously happened many times since then. In 2013, Columbia professor Prabhjot Singh, who was studying hate crimes against Sikhs, was wrongly believed to be Muslim and was a target himself for the same violence that he was studying. He was attacked by a group of young men on his way home in what was believed to be a hate crime. Quote, "I heard terrorist, Osama, get him," unquote, Singh recalled, explaining in a New York Times article after the attack that our turban and beard are a trigger for fear in the minds of many Americans. Public perception of Muslims as the bearded brown other post 9/11 functions as a shadowy parallel to Islamophobic state violence, the vigilante enforcer of racial categories of difference. Islamophobia is a lived reality for everyone who is Muslim. including those who are seen as Muslim but are not. Because Black Muslims are not perceived as Muslim, they face rogue Islamophobic violence less often, but when that violence comes, their deaths do not garner as much outrage or mobilize Muslims in the same ways. Around the same time that 3 young Arab Muslims were murdered in their Chapel Hill home, a Somali Muslim man was shot through the door of his apartment in Fort McMurray, Alberta. While Dia, Yusor, and Razan's deaths trended worldwide, Mustafa Matan's murder was barely a passing blip outside of the Somali community. In a thought-provoking article co-written by UCLA professor Khaled Beydoun and Muslim Anti-Racist Collaborative co-founder Margari Hill, entitled "The Color of Muslim Mourning," the authors pointedly asked the Muslim community who they prioritize and why. Dia's fundraiser for dental supplies for Syrian refugees went from $20,000 before his death to $380,000 afterwards. In contrast, Matan's family is still struggling to raise the $15,000 needed for his burial costs, they write. The reality for today's Black Muslims is bifurcated into a war fought on two fronts, a battle with one's own community to be seen and respected, as well as a battle to resist targeted state and vigilante violence. Black Muslims are also being surveilled, detained, and harassed by state operatives with increasingly alarming regularity. As Muslims and as politically concerned citizens, we know the name of someone like Omar Khadr. How many of us can say the name of Mehdi Hashi, a Black British Somali national who has been stripped of citizenship and rots away in detention in Manhattan after refusing to spy on other Muslims? The Muslim community's disinterest in his case speaks to the violence of what Frank B. Wilderson has named anti-Black solidarity. Even when protecting his community, Hashi remains invisible. At the turn of the 20th century, Du Bois mapped a conceptual understanding of the Black American subject. Quote, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." Double consciousness signifies a subjecthood, a self whose several identities are at odds with one another. To be Black and Muslim in America today is to live a sort of Du Boisian double consciousness with an added dimension of dissonant interiority. To be Black and Muslim is to occupy a space of simultaneous invisibility and hypervisibility. Blackness is hypervisible, perceived and consumed through the historical aperture of the brutality of slavery. The stereotypes about Black people that guide our most quotidian and unconscious choices dictate that Blackness is dangerous, something to be contained, a threat. Blackness does not ask the Black subject to legitimize their Blackness. It is simply a fact of one's being, a physicality that signifies much more than just melanin. But when you add the identity marker of Muslim to that of Black, something very different happens: erasure. Black Muslims remain invisible to their faith communities and to wider society, for Muslims, unlike Black people, must actively legitimize their identities through practicing faith, maintaining proximity to a community or a cultural inheritance. The hypervisibility of Blackness makes one's identity as a Muslim impossible precisely because Blackness precludes Muslimness in the cultural imaginary. So to occupy both subject positions is to experience the downward thrust of cognitive dissonance. You will always be too Black to be a true Muslim, but you must live with all of the pain that America inflicts on both Black people and Muslims. How are we to understand ourselves and our social locations if being Muslim precludes being Black, which cannot be reconciled with being an American subject? The historical and contemporary erasure of Black Muslims can only be situated in the context of a violent anti-Black solidarity. The Black Muslim in America must then contend with an economy of unresolved strivings towards faith, visibility, resistance, and self-determination. So that is part of that essay that I wrote. It lives on the New Inquiry, if you're interested. I think my thinking has changed in some ways, but, you know. So I'm going to now introduce our next speaker. Yunique A. Saafir is a visual artist. Her current mediums are photography and performance art. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, via a diasporic journey from Kingston, Jamaica. Her work explores personal experiences with emotional, mental health, and the idea that depression can illuminate the self and spark clarity. She was featured in Zain Alam, a queer Muslim photo project, and has presented her work with Dixon Place and Bufu, which is By Us For Us, a collaborative living archive centered around pan-Black and pan-Asian cultural and political relationships.
Hi, everyone. Well, I will be telling you folks a little story about me, a personal story about me, and yeah, I hope you like. Get comfortable. Bismillah. Even though I don't look like a traditional Muslim, I am somewhat modest in the way I dress. I like to think my style influenced by the lineage of family, ancestors, music, community, and also still influenced by Islam. When Muslim women look at me in Brooklyn, they know I'm Muslim. I feel their energy, they feel mine. We don't say anything, it's just a feeling right now. I want to be able to identify with them and have a desire to say, peace be upon with you, assalamu alaikum, and feel that connection. But I feel like I can't because of my queer appearance. I wear a do-rag. It holds the same importance and the holiness of my existence as a hijab. I call it my do-job. The do-job integrates my queerness to my Muslim identity. It also allows free. Islam was first introduced to me when my mom and her brother would always go to this place called the mosque, masjid. I was happy for her. She seemed completely submerged in a spiritual happiness I haven't seen in a while or ever. It seemed she found something bigger than herself. She sat me down one day to finally tell me what she had been up to. She told me about the Prophet Muhammad and invited me to the mosque with her. By letting me decide whether or not Islam was for me and what religion was going to look like for me, she gave me a platform to choose independence at 12. That has carried me progressing throughout my life. I felt proud to be a Muslim. I wanted to investigate how queerness applies to me and find self-care, worth within Black identity, within Black beauty. For a while, I converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with my mom's support, surprisingly. Though I felt the lack of Black identity and exclusion within Mormonism, being Mormon was an okay segue from being a Muslim. They have somewhat similar beliefs, but queerness is what caused me to leave Mormonism and go back to my Muslim faith. Allah never left me. I never left Allah. In my day-to-day life, I hold Allah close to my heart. I feel the guidance, and that's my relationship with Islam. Allah guiding me through my everyday life. My mother, Humeysha, also introduced me to astonishing black female musicians when I was younger, like Tracy Chapman. Tracy Chapman is a personal prophet to me. Her music gave me critical thinking, made me reflect upon the world as a whole and oneself. She meant so much to me and so many different eras in my life. She made me realize I was gay, then queer, then now just being. She taught me that I am cool even if others disagree, that I'm black, that I'm dark-skinned, that I'm good. Her music strengthened the bond between my mother and I. My mother had me at a very young age, 19 to be exact. So I think it was her way of saying, hey, listen to these melodies, these words, as I'm learning for myself. We would sing together songs like, she has got a ticket, I think she's gonna use it, I think she's gonna fly away. These words helped us both grow. Rita Marley, Anita Baker, Patra, Grace Jones, Lady Saw, Missy, Nina, Lauryn Hill, all were influential. Quote, don't forget about the Deen, the Salata Mustaqim. I totally messed that up, I'm so sorry. End quote. Comes from The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill and was released in 1998. The Deen, Allah, the Creator, God, you. Sirat al-Mustaqim is a common Arabic phrase that means the straight path or path of Allah. Lauryn Hill was also a very transformative for me. She has a lot of subtle references to Islam, and that made me feel connected. As an immigrant, queer Muslim, non-binary femme of color, I sometimes feel non-existent, even within my queer community. I used to think, there aren't many like me. Who can relate? Who's out there? Whom? Visible. Am I looking? For a while, I felt content sitting with these feelings. Then I stopped trying to figure out myself out. Instead, I propelled self into living my truths by continuing to speak with Allah and to speak to self. For I whispered, Yunique, you are Muslim. Sometime later, I received an email. The subject line said, are you Muslim? I replied in caps, yes. And I told her this story. I'm taking this collective visibility one step at a time. In Brooklyn, I have supreme people of color around me. I feel like when we're together, we storm through the oppression, but sometimes we laugh, we smile, we stay tender for each other. We're slaying separately, and now, finally, we're slaying together. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker panelist. Zain Alam is an artist whose work explores South Asian artistic traditions, transnational movements in the Islamic world, and diasporic identity in the United States. He was recently a BHQFU fellow, I'm not sure what that acronym is, but at Art Center, South Florida, and is currently a graduate student in Islamic Studies at Harvard. And the front man of the NYC-based recording project Humeysha. Written and conceived in India, Humeysha channels diverse influences echoing sounds from New York City to New Delhi. Give it up for Zain.
Hi there. So we'll be starting with a video that I actually made while I was with Bruce High Quality Foundation University in Miami. And this was a video that I made for the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is based in Philadelphia. And this video it draws from over 2 hours of footage from the 50s of a Sikh man who moved to the Midwest in the late 50s and married a white woman and started a family there. Far before the civil rights movement, far before Love Me Virginia. And when I came upon this footage, it really touched me. And so I edited the footage and wrote a little bit of a song. So I hope you guys enjoy. So that's only actually about half of the video. If anybody wants to see the full thing, it's on PRA. But I think the little context I wanted to give was as much of a beautiful story, the marriage is and how it looks. The moment when the video flips into, the footage flips into black and white and the song kind of comes in with my remix of this traditional Sikh prayer. Did anybody notice what changed with the father, the husband? Yes. So he wasn't wearing a turban, and right after the marriage, he was attacked at a gas station in Oklahoma. So that's where the beautiful part of this marriage comes to a crashing halt. So on that happy note, I'm gonna transition to reading a little bit of something I also wrote at Bruce High Quality in Miami. It's a piece called Islam and the Imagination, and it explores a lot of the similarities I see between creative practice, music, and prayer and spirituality in general. So I actually wrote this before I read Professor Abdul Khabeer's book, and I really hope we get to talk about all these overlaps because it made me so happy to read your book and see that a lot of what is going on in here, she's already done. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal asr. Inna al-insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina wa amanu as-salihat. Wa tawasaw bil haqq. Wa tawasaw bis sabr. By time, indeed, man is in loss, except those who have faith and do righteous deeds, and enjoin one another to follow the truth, and enjoin one another to do patience. The name of that surah is Al-Asr, which can be translated as the declining day. I'm a Muslim. Minutes after I was born at the Flushing Hospital here in Queens, my father whispered the Shahada into my ears. La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. I was introduced to Islam along with the world, and the rhythm of La ilaha illallah took the place of my mother's heartbeat. All other experiences were subsequent to the rhythms of Islamic verse. I'm also a musician. My songs take on new lives apart from me the moment they are shared. The process of songwriting is how I try to do justice what begins as a melody in my dreams. My task as a composer is simply to submit to the dream, guiding it to structure and feeling it into form, through a personal intuition that is informed by deep traditions. I may never know why singing songs brings me such pleasure, but sharing them with others comes from a desire to make something that may find some life beyond my own. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. O zid ilahi warattalil Qur'an ana tartila. Or add to it and recite the Quran in a measured space. Like most Muslims, I have memorized many verses from the Quran in their original Arabic, despite never understanding the language. My mother tongues are English and Urdu, the language my parents grew up speaking in Pakistan. My mother, grandmother, and Sunday school teachers all took part in teaching me how to recite the Quran without ever simultaneously learning how to understand it. Sunday school was at the Al-Hidayah Mosque, right off the highway, in a converted little trailer home in nearby Marietta, since we didn't have one in Kennesaw, Georgia. I often cried before being dragged to Sunday school and dreaded going for years, unable to understand the point of it all. But my inability to understand the words encouraged me to appreciate the poetic, musical qualities of Quranic Arabic. Today I am thankful for those rhythms and tones I internalized through countless hours of recitation. I also gained an aesthetic appreciation for the visual beauty of Arabic calligraphy, inscribed in our mosques, our homes, and Qurans all over the world. Islam is a supremely aesthetic religion. Between our primary acts of recitation and calligraphy, there emerges an enormous expanse of sonic and visual beauty. Only once I know what emotion a melody triggers in me can I use a scalpel of editing with great care, deciding which notes are essential, where in time they belong, the dynamics felt in between them. Arriving at this stage without devoting myself to the melody results in something perhaps formally sound, but emotionally hollow. One can always hear when a sound that once had spirit has been sanitized for structure. I may end up with the same stiff result if I do not listen for fine, unexpected details, perhaps more beautiful than the notes they decorate. I can take these gentle, subtractive steps only once I have devoted enough time and energy, conscious and subconscious, to know the sounds intimately. My first impulse some mornings is to grab my phone and record the melody playing in my dreams before it is lost in the noise of the day. I will hum the melody, strum it on my guitar, pick it out on the piano, so its memory becomes habit. Now is not the time to ask too many questions or suggest corrections. Like a lover, the melody has just entered and must feel at home, welcome, showered with attention, growing comfortable in my presence. I keep repeating the melody, caressing every note in whispers until I know just how it feels. أودع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين. Invite all to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and argue with them in ways that are best and most gracious. For your Lord knows best who has strayed from his path and who receives guidance. My songs have always begun as songs that trickle down into my dreams. In the Quran, sleep is sometimes compared to death. God takes our souls before returning them once we awaken and say thanks, whereas in death, the final return is to the divine. There is a long Islamic tradition behind the interpretation of stories, dreams included, that some call science. But for me, these hymn-like visions demand less critical thought and more contemplation. So instead, I watch and listen as the notes play to a pulse, whirling in circles until they take form. With the help of spiritualization and gratitude for the blessing that is music, I endeavor to bring forth what begins as a dream into an object that occupies space and time. My critical faculties cannot disrupt the creative process. They should sleep until it's time to rise. Contemplation and spiritual stirrings are more than enough to guide and protect the melody before it reaches the light of day. Where the sounds all come from is beyond my knowledge. All I can do is pursue them. La ilaha illallah. Per Islamic custom, as I first witnessed when my uncle passed away, someone will whisper into my ear those words, the Shahada. There is no God but God. From where all existence begins, all existence must return. Thank you. And because this is such a special event, I wanted to show something that is in progress and hasn't been released, or at least the first couple minutes of it. This is a video that'll probably be out in a few weeks that I also made while I was in Miami. Miami was a place that reminded me of this idea that I've had for a while, that American cities are ghost towns and graveyards, covered over with thin layers of what glimmers on the surface, all to varying degrees of success, or lack thereof. What happens when we try to take a peek at what is underneath? What histories and possibilities have we tried to forget, and at what cost? The name of that song is Black, Brown, Gold, and hopefully you'll see it somewhere in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. And now it is my supreme pleasure to introduce the person whose book this entire event is organized around, Dr. Su'ad Abdul Khabeer, the author of Muslim Cool, Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in the United States, which is a text that investigates the concept of Muslim cool. The term refers to how young American Muslims draw on blackness, often via hip hop, to construct their own identities and challenge racist American norms. The result of ethnographic research with young black Muslims in Chicago, the University of Michigan professor investigates the interconnections between black and Muslim identity, countering notions that the two are fundamentally different. H. Zain Alam writes, Muslim cool is, as Dead Prez once rapped, bigger than hip-hop. It is a must-read for anyone interested in race, religion, and culture in contemporary America. Dr. Su'ad.
Good evening, everyone. I greet you with universal greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank everyone with the Asian American Writers Workshop for hosting this event and inviting me to share my work. I also want to thank everyone who also participated in this, and I'm looking forward to the conversation sort of after. So I'm going to read something sort of from the book and from the sort of introduction and the conclusion. And I want to begin this brief reading, as I do the book, in the name of Allah, for the love of Muhammad, to honor the ancestors, and in celebration of my people. And as the descendant of stolen people on stolen land, I begin also by acknowledging that the land upon which we gather is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape people, and that some of us are uninvited guests on this land. And since we are commemorating the month of Muharram on the Islamic calendar, I also begin by acknowledging that every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. Esperanza. See, I have a camouflage scarf. I've worn it only once because this Pakistani girl walked up to me like, this is so cool. And I was like to myself, I can't even pretend that's okay with me. And it's a girl that I love. Now, I want to back this up by saying I've been wearing camouflage my whole life. I'm the camouflage queen. I wear it a lot because I like it, but also because I feel like I can. It's appropriate for me to wear it because my brother was in the war. Like, it's my actual name on my jacket. Anyway, so the sister just comes to me really sincerely. I really like your scarf. Where can I get it from? And I was kind of like, thank you. But I don't know really what else to say. It's a compliment, but another way it's a thievery because we don't have much, right? Like, where does culture come from? It comes from people who don't have much. That's where hip hop comes from. That's where house music came from. That's where tying your hair up in a scarf, wearing fatigues because you ain't got no other clothes, right? You going home to silverware that's really silver, but you taking my scarf? Just let me have something. And I get it. You can't really tell people what to put on their bodies. I get that. But there is a certain level you can at least give due to where it's done and at least try to do it authentically yourself. You have to know your boundaries and give knowledge and respect. Esperanza is a single mother in her 30s. She's a Latina multimedia artist who loves to teach but also teaches to pay the bills. I met up with her in her home in Humboldt Park in Chicago, and after she let her kids know, quote, "We handle an important business here," unquote, we lounged and she shared her reflections on being raced, gendered, classed, and Muslim. Although Esperanza is a convert to Islam and was born and raised in Chicago, and I was born to Muslim parents and raised in Brooklyn, we hit it off right away. This was because of the other things we had in common: Latinidad, being part of the hip-hop generation, and having intimate knowledge of the joys and frustrations of growing up working class in the hood. I had seen Esperanza at hip-hop culture events around the city before we formally met at Iman, the Inner City Muslim Action Network. Iman is a Muslim-run nonprofit that provides services, community organizing, and arts-based activism on the southwest side of Chicago. Iman was a key site of my research, just as it was a place of central importance to my interlocutors, who I refer to as my teachers, because I drew on their generous sharing of their knowledge and experience in over 10 years of research. My teachers are US Black, Latinx, Arab, and South Asian American Muslims engaged in hip-hop-based activism. They are the progenitors of a discourse and epistemology, a way of thinking and exchanging ideas, an aesthetic, forms of style, and an embodiment, ways of being in the world that I call Muslim cool. Forged at the intersection of Islam and hip-hop, Muslim cool is a way of being Muslim that draws on blackness to contest anti-blackness, as it shows up in the religious and cultural hegemonies of Arab and South Asian US American Muslim communities on one hand, and in the hegemonies of whiteness on the other. Esperanza wore camouflage because she liked it, but also because racialized systemic inequalities had shut her family out of economic opportunity and shuttled her brother into the service. In contrast, the quote-unquote Pakistani girl who thought the camouflage was cool had access to a set of class-based and cultural privileges. She was educated and suburban and had more quote-unquote cultural authenticity as a Muslim. Accordingly, the Pakistani girl's potential appropriation of camouflage was embedded in unequal power relations. Esperanza loved the girl loved her scarf, but, as Esperanza put it, all that love was fraught, no matter, quote, no matter how much Islam they had in common, unquote. Yet, the camouflage-loving Pakistani girl was not merely a cultural third wheel. She was also a raced and gendered Muslim subject navigating her identity at the crossroads of hip-hop and Islam. The Pakistani girl in Esperanza's story reminded me of Rabia, one of my key teachers. I could imagine Rabia admiring Esperanza's scarf with the same kind of unbridled enthusiasm. But in contrast to the first Pakistani girl, Rabia was an activist who worked in Inglewood, a predominantly black neighborhood in Chicago. For Esperanza, Rabia was different, because the struggle was not just a fashion accessory for her. However, she noted insightfully that this did not mean that Rabia, she, or any of us could escape the complex realities of race, identity, and power in the fight to overcome inequality. This insight is critical to understanding Muslim cool, because at the meeting of Islam and hip-hop, the ways Muslimness and blackness come together both challenge and reconstitute the meanings of race in the United States. So I make three central arguments in the book. First, I argue that blackness is central to what we call US American Islam. This means that blackness shapes the individual Muslim experience in the US, whether that person is black or not, and interethnic Muslim relationships, like in the case of Esperanza and the Pakistani girl. And it also shapes the terms of how US Muslims deal with the state. Second, I make the case for the continuing significance of race and blackness in the contemporary US and identify the ways in which race, specifically blackness, is marshaled in the work of anti-racism. All of this means Muslim cool is complex. There is a push and a pull at its core that is grounded in hip-hop as a site of critical contestation and contradiction. The contradictions and contestations of hip-hop are often depicted through the homonyms roots and roots. And some people say routes, but they're wrong. Hip hop is rooted in Afro-diasporic expressive cultures and has traveled on routes far beyond its origins. To the pair of roots and roots, I add the loop. I take loop from the hip hop sampling technique. Whereas roots and roots extend and splinter into multiple pathways, the loop extends and returns, not in a closure, but in a cipher, the communal and competitive space in which hip hop culture regenerates and develops. The loop is a metaphor for the linkages between Islam, hip hop, and blackness in the 21st century that create Muslim cool. Black Islam, from Malcolm X samples over breakbeats in the 80s to A Tribe Called Quest at the Grammys in 2017, gave hip hop knowledge of self, which in turn helps young 21st century black and non-black US Muslims return to blackness and Islam as a way to discover their own knowledge of self as Muslim cool. Yet this is all complicated by my third central argument. Any analysis of contemporary blackness must contend both with the ways in which it is used to resist white supremacy and can be complicit with white supremacy. When young Muslims, black and non-black, engage blackness as a form of resistance, they risk reproducing long-standing discourses that both devalue blackness, think minstrelsy, and co-opt blackness, think a whitewashed MLK. And throughout the book, I make this argument for Muslim cool's bona fides as a counter-discourse and a counter-performativity of Muslimness in which, in contrast to dominant paradigms, blackness is central. Yet, in the present context, Muslim cool's alterity, its counterness, is constrained and entangled with the state. Entanglements with the state are particularly pertinent to Muslim cool because as Muslims, my teachers are subject to both the post-civil rights multicultural state and the parallel post-9/11 surveillance state. On the one hand, the state seeks to quote-unquote include US Americans, Muslims as a multiracial US minority group like African Americans, to use the official term, as proof of American exceptionalism. On the other hand, the category Muslim stands as a signifier of a threat to the state, and Muslims are thus frequently questioned as to their belonging. These parallel state discourses create a political landscape in which US American Muslims, in order to contest claims they do not belong to the nation, must cut a hard bargain with the state. Accordingly, Muslim cool is also a timely illustration of the very real constraints on the political imaginaries of a critical racial and religious minority. These constraints are significant, but as the movement for Black Lives has demonstrated, they are not surmountable. And this is the second section I'm reading from the conclusion, which is entitled #Black Lives Matter, in which I was trying to consider what did Muslim cool mean to the movement. So at the Black Lives Matter protest I attended while preparing this manuscript, it was common for organizers to lead demonstrators in chanting a mantra composed by the US Black woman revolutionary activist Assata Shakur. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. It was reported on social media that in a confrontation with police at the conclusion of the Movement for Black Lives convening, which I did not attend, demonstrators also chanted, "We gonna be all right," the chorus of a song with the same name by the hip-hop artist Kendrick Lamar. I think these verses, Shakur's and Lamar's, point to what the future may hold for Muslim cool. The future of Muslim cool and of Muslims in the United States more broadly lies in its investment in its alterity, the ability to imagine, articulate, and participate in alternate choices for resistance and political vision. This is a prospect that comes at high risk, but we have nothing to lose but our chains. We gonna be all right. Thank you.
feel like we're on a talk show right now. Okay. So, the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask Dr. Saad some questions first, if that's okay, and then I will open it up to all three of you. So one of the things that I loved about your book, and that which Yunique brought up also, was that aesthetics functions as a form of coded resistance, basically, to the state. So for example, do-rags or do-jabs or head wraps or hijabis or Muslim dandyism, which you also cited. So how do the aesthetics of Muslim cool function in terms of creating outcomes that oppose white supremacist empire?
Thank you. For those who haven't had the chance to read yet, what she's referring to are a couple of chapters in the book where I talk specifically about style. I speak specifically about a particular headscarf style, and I also speak about this idea of Muslim men who sort of are engaging black dandyism as a way to respond to sort of some anti-blackness in Muslim communities, and also simultaneously respond to the sort of pathologization of black men as sort of nihilists, right? This kind of idea. And so I think what I discuss in the book and what I think about this is that style, one of the things about style is that it can have multiple meanings depending on who's reading it, right? And that style is something that people use often to make a statement, but that statement is what we call sort of polysemous, right? It has many meanings. And so one of the things that I talk about is how, for example, when it comes to headscarf styles, I talk about the ways in which, like a scarf style, say something like what I'm wearing right now, right? Which is something that comes out of Afro-diasporic tradition, but it's also something that black Muslim women have made Muslim, right? So in terms of if you believe that modesty in dress is something that you're supposed to do as a Muslim person, right? Then black Muslim women have said, well, this is a form of that, right? Now this is a form of resistance to sort of kind of anti-blackness in the Muslim community because it goes against sort of notions, and I don't really use the word hijab, I hate the word hijab, but notions of what that should look like, right? So it contests that. But also, right, it contests broader questions of white supremacy and anti-blackness and sort of because it also is sort of asserting and affirming Africanity, Africanness. It's asserting kind of a different way of being in the world, right, that really sort of goes against the dominant forms of what is or what is not beautiful, right? So this is happening at the same time. Likewise, in terms of men, and one of the things too, both in the study of Muslims in general and in the study of style and fashion, men and Muslim men are often not discussed, right? As if what they wear is not significant. But what everyone wears is significant. Even if you think you're not being significant, you're being significant, right? In terms of what you're doing. And so I talk about dandyism, and people who are familiar with black dandyism, black dandyism is a historic, like the dandy in general is kind of like a figure that is sort of a man who is sort of transgressing norms, right? Particularly around class and also gender, and dressing sort of above their station, right? As a way of sort of asserting that. Black dandyism likewise was doing that, but often also in terms of sort of contradicting sort of white supremacist ideas of black inferiority through style and dress. But it's not a complete copy, like a mimicry, it's sort of a remix, right? So sort of taking those sort of dominant styles and kind of making them your own. And so what I found in my research was that there were these men that are prominent members of sort of the US Muslim community, not a ton, because dandies aren't a ton of them, right? But they are influential, and they were doing the same kind of thing. But they were speaking again to kind of saying, okay, people think of black men as thugs, right? And so I dress in a way that really is, that is sort of contradicting that. Contradicting that, though, not to say, oh, I dress just like white men, but to say I dress like my father and my grandfather. I dress like the suited and booted nation of Islam, right? And I also dress like sort of symbolically, I dress like my Muslim predecessors because I put a lot of care into what I'm wearing, right? And this is important because it's contradicting those ideas, but at the same time, and this is what Muslim Cool does, it's kind of doing two things at once. It's also, again, counteracting anti-blackness in Muslim communities that would say, in order for you to be an authority, you have to dress like someone in Karachi or Cairo and not somebody in Brooklyn. So.
Amazing. Okay, so one of my favorite films, Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash, is set off the coast of Georgia, and it concerns a multi-generational Gullah or Geechee family and has a very memorable scene in which someone leads a Muslim prayer. You edit a publication called Sapelo Square, which is named for the oldest Muslim community in the U.S. On an island off the coast of Georgia, which actually Zain and I both grew up in, weirdly. So talk to me about the roots of Islam in this country, which are distinctly black, and the connection back to this idea of being conscious, of knowing yourself and your worth, as Drake would say, and your history in order to paradoxically look forward.
Okay. Yeah, so Sapelo, the Sapelo Islands, sort of off the coast of Georgia, and we, like she said, for Sapelo Square, we chose that as a place to sort of ground ourselves, because the site itself is dedicated to the documentation and analysis of Black Muslims in the United States. And we chose Sapelo also because of this kind of early Muslim history, but also a diasporic one, right? Because we know that relationships between the Sea Islands and the Caribbean, and how sort of Black people have moved throughout the diaspora, and how Muslim Black people have moved throughout sort of the diaspora in this part of the world. And so I think in terms of this question of history, I think there are 2 points we can start when we talk about the history of Islam in this hemisphere. So there's a kind of traditional story that begins, or I should say traditional, accepted story, in which we sort of acknowledge that Muslims came to this part of the world either as navigators on European ships or as enslaved people. There's another story that is more controversial that argues that Muslims actually came to this hemisphere before the Europeans did. There's a documentation, Mansa Musa, who was sort of the king of Mali, sort of the Mali, well, what today is Mali, the empire. His brother, they sent a ship west, which didn't return, but then there's sort of these kind of artifacts people find that indicate sort of Arabic and things like this. But that's controversial historically, but it exists in any event, right? They came before Columbus type thing, which is a book by Abdul Hakim Quick where he documents this. Whatever origin point you accept, right? What that means is that Islam, as a religious tradition, has a really long history in the United States, and whether they were sort of from a Malian empire in Africa, or whether they were sort of navigators from Andalus, which means they were also from Africa, right, when they came, or whether they were they might have been Iberian too. Let's be real about that. or if they were enslaved Muslims, right, enslaved Africans. There's this relationship, and it's old, and so this blackness that you talk about is really grounded. I think the other thing I want to add to that, and so from that history, and I won't go on, but so we have this early history, and then we have people sort of paying attention to sort of antebellum South and the ways in which people tried to hold on to their religious tradition. Of course, we know for all enslaved people this was really difficult, right? Because the nature of slavery, particularly in the United States, was to dehumanize you and take away your choice. Yet we have documentation. So there's a really good book, Servants of Allah by Sylvia Juf, and she describes, for example, because when women in the Sea Islands who would sort of take from the rations they would get of food, and they would take rice, and there was a practice where they were from in West Africa. The sadaqah is the word in Arabic for charity, but there was a practice where they were from West Africa where you would give out these kind of rice cakes as a form of charity. So they would ration off from their rations and save pieces of rice to put together to create rice cakes to share with their family. So there are these ways in which sort of enslaved African Muslims were trying to retain their tradition, particularly in the United States. Not particularly, I'm saying that's an U.S. example. But what I want to say, I think, is that, and then we have a resurgence, right? We see sort of in the early part of the 20th century of Islam sort of returning as practice, not through individual stories, but as a communal practice. But one of the things I think is important, and this is something that I think sometimes is missed when we talk about the history of Islam in the United States and its relationship to blackness, is this is a history of resistance and struggle. So I think sometimes what happens is there's a tendency to, as a way of getting a seat at the table in the United States, to talk about enslaved African Muslim ancestors as a way of sort of saying, okay, well, I belong here. But I think what's important is if we look at who these people were, and if we look at some of these individual stories, like the document, there's a PBS documentary called The Prince Among Slaves, which is about Abdurrahman Ibrahim ibn Suri, who was from Futa Jalon. And it tells his story. But when he got the opportunity, he went home, right? He didn't stay. And it was bittersweet for him because he had children and he died trying to get them. But it wasn't like, let me find a place to stay here, right? When we look at enslaved African Muslims, for example, in Bahia in Brazil, they led a revolt. When we look at the Haitian Revolution, and we know that Muslims were participating in that, so my point is that, yes, there's a long history of blackness and Islam in the United States, but that's a history that I think is really about, or the thread that goes through it is this black radical tradition and this idea of kind of you've been displaced and dispossessed, and now you're here, and your job and your spiritual imperative is to fight that, right, and improve that, and not to sort of become part of it. So I just think that's important to kind of, bring out.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Okay, so I guess we can open it up now for everybody. So in the book, Dr. Suad draws a distinction between what she names as instrumentalization, or a deep, respectful commitment to the ideals of a community, versus appropriation, which is a sort of shallow, apolitical, usually aesthetic thievery of like a culture. You've heard the term culture vulture before. So when it comes to Black hood culture in particular, I think there's a tendency to appropriate. How do we distinguish instrumentalizing culture in a useful way, particularly in the context of Muslim cool, from appropriation, given the history of anti-Black racism, and present, not just history, like current, contemporary, present, of anti-Black racism in the wider Muslim community, quote unquote.
Can I just clarify one thing about what you said?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I don't use instrumentalization as something that actually is, instrumentalization, as I use in the book, is a form of appropriation, right? So the idea, the point that I try to make is that there are these kind of two ways that we engage Blackness in the United States, but also as Muslims. And one is to devalue it, right? So it's not Islamic, it's religiously suspect, or to instrumentalize it. So yeah, let's bring the Black person to come and like help fundraise for something or this kind of thing, but there is no actual real engagement with Black people, right? It's just this, so we include it, but just to use it as a tool for our own purposes, not because we're actually sort of engaging with the Black Muslims and Black experiences. So that's all under appropriation for me. On the flip side, I guess, is this idea, and I don't think I have a word for it that I'm using, but this idea of actually not doing either one of those things, like having a relationship to Blackness, even taking on particular sort of practices, but not doing either one of those things because you actually have relationships with Black people. So yeah. I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah, no, of course. So I guess, how do we fall into the good category? I mean, besides no Black people, which you should. What are particularly like as artists, which you two are, like how do you How do you not do the former?
I think one of the biggest things that people who are doing the appropriation of black culture, whether they are Muslim, whether they are not Muslim in America, is that they don't even ask. They don't ask, is it okay for me to use this? They don't ask, is it appropriate for me to use this? Is it appropriate for me to use it in this way? There's this idea that because people have been doing it for so long, we can just keep doing it. We can just keep taking things from black culture. That's the reservoir from which America gets all of its culture without having to pay them, without having to pay respect to them, without having to acknowledge the influence and the importance that they've had in these things. And I think specifically talking about South Asian Muslims and Arab Muslims and Muslims who are not black, there is definitely a component, I think now more than ever, where if they all of a sudden start crying wolf when they're getting deported, it is totally right. They need to look back inward and think, where have we been when black communities have been assaulted and slaughtered for decades? Where have you been? In your aspirational whatever whiteness that you are pretending to do, where have you been for your fellow Muslims? And if you haven't been asking, if you don't know any black Muslims, how are you even going to get to that stage? And I mean, I know you wrote the book before, obviously, the election, but I'm younger and haven't been in America for as long as some of the people in the older generation have. But when they cry wolf, you always got to ask them, where were you at? Where were you at when this was happening? And once you can start to give me an answer to that question or start to work to fix that, which is going to take a long time, and it always takes a long time to win trust. And when you lose trust, it never comes back. That's the hard work that brown folks need to do, that South Asian folks need to do, that Arab folks need to do before they can expect black people who have the experience and the knowledge for far longer to, I don't know, feel your struggle, come to your pain, which is also not to say that black Muslims are also not being deported and also part of the same thing. But there's a much bigger, I think, trajectory that other Muslims have missed for a long time.
And thank you. But let me rephrase this for Yunique. Sorry. So as a black artist, what would you not want to see? Like, how would you want people to respect you and like your traditions and that sort of thing?
I think for me, even within my community, people always like assume things. Even with my do-rag, people may not ask. I think that the tongue is so powerful, and for me, it's a way to like go back to like how do I dismantle my identity, or how I dismantle like appropriation. I start to tell people like, hey, you can't necessarily ask me this, or you can't necessarily say like, hey, like, oh, you're not wearing your do-rag today, you look so free. Well, actually, when I have my do-rag on, that's when I feel most free sometimes, so that's what that is for me. But just to go back to like what you were saying, I feel just talking about what I want, and for people to hear me, and for people to not necessarily consume me in how they're seeing me, but really like finding the nuances of that, and like dismantle that for yourself before you come to me. I feel like that would actually help where I am right now. And yeah.
And if I could just add one last thing too, I think this question of knowing, when I say a sort of, the non-black Muslims that I worked with in my research, when I say they have relationships with black people, it's not, what I mean is that they both sort of know like flesh and blood black people, but they are actually engaged with black communities around issues that matter to black communities and to all of us, really, right? And so, and what you said about asking is really interesting, because one of the women in the book, she's Pakistani, U.S. American, and she tied her scarf in a bun, and she said, she liked the style, she thought it was cool. She said, maybe I saw Erykah Badu wear it, I don't know, I could wear my earrings out, that's cool. But she's like, but I know it has a cultural resonance or meaning. So she's like, I waited. I was a part of this group at Iman. I was doing but I waited basically to sort of kind of get permission. And it wasn't like, I think it was unspoken. It wasn't like, hey, but it was kind of like, I'm a part of this community. And so she waited until she felt that she could feel comfortable, because she didn't want to, sort of, kind of just come in and do that. And I think that, that's a process, right? It's not something that happens overnight. It's a process. But you have to be in the flesh with people working together for that to actually happen,
Yeah. Okay, so to kind of pivot, in my opinion, there's a crisis of moral authority in the wider Muslim community, as in, you're not really Muslim if you're black, you're not really Muslim if you're queer, you're not really Muslim if you're a convert. This leads to a lot of erasure and a lot of hiding. There's also a lot of putting on of piety. Not to call anyone out, but all this stuff with Numan Ali Khan lately has been eye-opening. And Dr. Saad goes into this in the text. Have any of you experienced this personally? How is it detrimental to us as Muslims, and are there potential solutions?
Sure. Can you actually repeat the question again? Like how, what affects me personally?
Yeah, just the idea of moral authority being this dubious thing in our community, and people kind of hiding and performing piousness in ways that don't really feel honest. What's your experience of it, and also how is it detrimental, and what are the solutions?
Yeah. I mean, kind of a little bit about the story that I told you folks. Finding Islam through my mom and in Jamaica. Fast forward though, coming here, I came here the summer of 9/11, and I was so happy, we're gonna have this American dream and all this stuff. I came here with my hijab at the time, and it was great. And all of a sudden, I'm not really sure, after 9/11, I didn't necessarily think about this, and even to this day, I didn't necessarily process why I stopped wearing my hijab, but it was gone. I came here at 13, and by 15, don't even think I was identifying as a Muslim anymore. And, I mean, it was not everybody know what happened in 9/11, and the influx of hate and crime, and that is still lingers in the, today in America when it comes to the Muslim community and people of color just in general. I think a lot of that made me felt inward, made me felt scared, made me felt fearful, and it took my religion away in some sense. But now that I'm coming and telling you folks the story that, about the validation that I felt in myself, and the validation that I felt that was my true being, looking back at my lineage, feeling comfortable to use that powerful tongue of mine, is really what dismantled all those fears, all that. I know it's systematic depression and oppression, however, just making me feel like I'm still living, and I'm still here to allow myself to be with Allah and to talk to Allah and to know that, in some sense I am Allah. And yeah, that's how I dismantle that for me.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think one of the most important things, so that we don't see this repetition, which you mentioned in your book as well, of certain people are uncomfortable with MSAs, who are uncomfortable with certain kind of mosques, where if you don't look a certain way, you don't do a certain thing, you don't follow a certain practice, you are immediately kind of castigated or cast out in a way. To me, it's still kind of mind-blowing that people are doing that in an age where the community is already kind of under assault from so many other directions. And it's the fact that you are turning this dynamic of wanting to destroy and take down and strip of Muslimness as a thing that you push forward. I don't know where it comes from. You might have more to say to it, having spent a lot of time in Muslim communities. I think it's sometimes for a lot of people, it's this thing of, it releases some kind of insecurity and the ability to say, well, that's not true Islam, or you're not a true Muslim. It's such a basic thing in the same way that anybody who's really strongly ideological, it's just like, well, you're not a true communist. You're not like really a card-carrying party member of this. And it's like, what does, in Islam, you can convert to Islam if you just say the Shahada, that you believe in one God and that Muhammad was the last prophet. You say that and you can become Muslim. So the fact that I will say even at a place like Harvard, you have people in the MSA who, the speakers are always student-led, and you'll have somebody who very thinly veiled will just say in a way that if you don't pray this way and you don't pray this number of times, you shouldn't be here, and also we have pretext to like never let you back into the community as a way of pushing Shias out. It's like, okay, man, there's already only like 20 people in this MSA. What are you doing pushing out like the 5 or 6 that are here, making them super uncomfortable, making them never want to come back? And I really think the best answer to this that I found, and obviously the people who are at Harvard are blessed to have the resources and the space to do this, is go and make your own community. Go and make your own community of Muslims who will not care about the Shia Sunni thing, who will accept queer Muslims, who will accept Muslims that are of various national backgrounds, who are converts. And that's really the way that we are going to avoid falling into this, what I like to, I think the phenomenon is like, I call it like decaying diasporas, where it's like all these people of the exact same type just post up and post into one place. And instead of just using that place as a way of support, they use that as a place to define very clearly that these are who Muslims are, everybody else can stay out. And I think when that happens, I'm not going to use foul language, but screw them and go and make your own thing. One of the strongest things we have as Muslims is the absence of central authority. So go and make it with people who you trust and you love. And it's gonna be an organic way that we regenerate if there's some degree of a rotten core in these communities.
Okay, so I think in terms of your point about like why do basically borders and boundaries become important when a community is under assault? And so I think that can happen sometimes because you're under assault, defining yourself becomes really important, right? That this is who we are. Because being under assault often means other people are naming you, right? So I think that kind of impetus is not in and of itself, a negative thing. I think the question is that what you put in that sort of like circle, is something that people might want to try to problematize. I think it's important to recognize, of course, that Muslims have been doing this you're in and out thing since the Prophet Muhammad died, right? So that's a good 1,400 and some odd years. So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. What I do think is possible, however, though, is one, and I think there are people who work on this, they call it sort of like Islamic literacy, so that people have a sense of a diversity, because beyond even like queer, I mean, just like Hanafi, like schools of thought type of people don't know about. You know what I mean? So we're not even talking about like gender and sexuality. We're just talking about just, something really sort of well within orthodoxy that people don't know, right? And so I think one is just kind of like expand, sort of bringing more literacy to Muslims in general around, it's actually, you've been doing this thing this way, and that's okay. But people have been doing it this way, and that's also okay, right? So that's, I think, one kind of thing that needs to happen. And then also, I think, related to this question is, I think of what both of the speakers said, I think there is a sense of, I think, reinforcing or trying to reinforce this notion of sort of family, so fraternity, sorority, right? This idea that we are connected to each other. Because I do think that I don't think that all difference is going to melt. Well, I don't believe that will happen. But I do think there's ways in which we can be connected to each other. We can respect differences and be connected to each other. And still be able and support because we are a group, right, that has particular things that are happening to it. So I think it's kind of like, so how do we sort of inculcate, I think, a position in which you see another Muslim, even though you don't agree with them, but you see them and your feelings towards them are sort of love and generosity. And you find a way to sort of be together, even though you're differ. And strongly differ. I'm not saying, oh, they're Hanafi and I'm Shafi. I mean, like, they'll strongly differ on something, but nevertheless have a kind of love and generosity where you can find ways to sort of link to each other, because as a whole, we need those relationships in order to, sort of really be strong in the face of the assault, right, that the community as a whole is facing.
Yes, absolutely. For me, I think it's like a question of self-love. Like, because I love myself, I love all the different flavors of Muslim that there are. Okay, so last question, kind of touching on like where we ended there, is for each of you, is Muslim cool ultimately a vehicle for solidarity across the racial coalition of people of color and black people, or, sorry, white Muslims, like, I know y'all are out there, but didn't actually consider you in this calculus. Are the structural rifts that exist across the Muslim community of color too wide to be confronted?
Do you mind repeating the question one more time?
Of course, it's a large question. Is Muslim cool ultimately a vehicle for solidarity across the racial coalition of people of color and black people? Or do you believe that the structural rifts that exist across the Muslim community are too wide to be confronted?
Not that I think that they're too wide, but as we all have been saying, I think I think when I think Muslim cool, I think individualism. Like, I think like, oh, I see myself in that word somewhere. Probably it's like the M and like the two O's and maybe the L. Like, I just kind of see like a spectrum of myself across that, and I feel like that's something that everybody could feel. And for me, I'm not looking for it for me personally, I'm not looking for it to make me feel like connected in community necessarily, but more of a connection to myself so I can propel that respect in differences for each other. Yeah.
I think also connected to the last question and what we were talking about in terms of difference in how Muslims, maybe face off against each other. I completely missed this and should have said in the last answer, but there's also a huge degree of orientalization and remnants of empire that have made it that we have this hate against one another and think of ourselves in ways that have to be very cleanly cut and cleanly defined. Whereas if you go, even when I go to our ancestral city, which is Lucknow in India, it's like a very famous seat of Shia Muslim culture in North India, and they do the processions during Muharram, and it's not only Sunni and Shia Muslims doing it together and having it in their homes, but Hindus also join who have lived in Lucknow for a very long time. And very recently, a lot of the elders say like in the last, it's been kind of boiling since the end of the British Empire, but it's now really kicked up a notch in the last 10, 20 decades, is because of how much Shias and Sunnis in Lucknow have started to absorb this identity of like, because of these doctrinal differences you have, you guys are completely different people who need to be faced up against one another. And I think exactly what you're saying about Islamic literacy, if we look back at our own history and we look at the history of Islam across the Silk Road and we look at the rise of languages like Urdu, or like how much the languages in like Arabic and Persian borrowed from one another, and how Islam was almost like a vehicle for things to travel so far across from one side of the world to the other, and to remember that those walls haven't always been there, I think is something that people forget a lot of times. And I think when you look at Islamic art from, at least for me, when I look at Islamic art from Africa or look at Islamic art from India, there is a degree of simplicity, of ornamentation, and of love for pattern, and of, you know, not having figures that unites them in a way that it's very simple and it's very basic. And obviously there's a huge world diversity in between those two things, but there is something there. There's something there, and I think that something that is there is so fundamental in us having some vocabulary and language to speak to one another. And I think back to Muslim Cool, this practice that we see now is very modern and very hip hop of like sampling and remixing. It's something that Muslims have been doing since the very beginning. And using those techniques, but also using those techniques back to what we were saying earlier in a way that is respectful and aware of the differences and aware of needing to ask and being respectful, is the way that we are going to have this beautiful aesthetic made and for Muslims that I dream, you know, one day we'll have.
So yes, I think that Muslim Cool ultimately is about solidarity. Solidarity is complicated, but it is about solidarity. So I know I don't think the rifts are too wide, and I think one of the things that's important going to this point on history, too, is that, you know, one of the things that I argue as well, specifically speaking about kind of the non-Black Muslims in the study, is that, you know, what they are also doing is they're also kind of rejuvenating earlier Afro-Asian, Afro-Arab sort of relationships, even sort of contemporary, like 20th century relationships. You know, one of the things, when you think about the history of Islam in the United States, and you think about something like the Nation of Islam, you know, the Nation of Islam comes into existence because you have this Muslim who's an immigrant from kind of a Muslim majority space, and this Black man who's a migrant from the South, and they meet, right, in the sort of industrialized North, and it's because of those connections and relationships we get the Nation of Islam. And so there, you know, I was thinking even of your piece on the video, and I was thinking there's a book called Bengali Harlem, right, where it's talking about, right, so there are these histories, and you know, part of the thing, and who was I reading this? I was reading about, let's see, I think it's in this book called Black Radical Futures. I think this is where I was reading it. I don't remember who the author is, but they were saying that, you know, or maybe it was Cedric Robinson or his wife. But anyway, in this book, I'll remember it and I'll tell someone and we can tweet it or something. But the point they were saying is that, you know, the fact that we have to retell these histories over and over again, right, is one, a symbol of their power, but also two, right, it's just these erasures of white supremacy, right? So, like, you know, so we don't even know that we've done this already, and we think we're starting over again. It's like we're not. It's like this already existed, and so I think that one of the things that Muslim Cool does, and I think this is because of relationship to Blackness, because of how hip hop, and even hip hop as pedagogy, is that really it's about sort of, you know, knowledge of self. You have to know who you are, right? You have to know your past, so you can know where you stand right now, and then you can do something, you know, sort of to change the world, and that's really so key. And so I think Muslim Cool can lead to solidarity because Muslim Cool leads to knowledge of self.
Okay, so I think. Okay, so we're gonna take 3 questions from the audience at this stage. Who has a question? All at the same time, and then our panelists will choose which to respond to. Yes. Sorry.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the conversation. I think I just have a brief question. Do you think that the Nation of Islam makes it harder for disparate groups of Muslims, both non-Black and Black, to form solidarity? I've talked to a lot of Muslims in different countries, both Black and non-Black, and one of the biggest problems they say is that while the Nation of Islam is a great tool for what you describe Muslim Cool, they do say that there's some parts of it that they can't help but to say are heresy. And so I just wanted to get your opinion on that and see, you know, do you think it helps, do you think it harms, or do you think it's immaterial?
Yeah, I don't.
Hi. So my question was, it seems a lot of the discussion about Muslim Cool with you guys was engaging with like the outside world. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on the role of Muslim cool in engaging with like anti-blackness and sexism within like our actual communities. If that makes sense. Oh no, like inside, like with our elders, like in the, you know what I'm saying? Like in our immediate communities, as in contrast to like the outside world or whatever.
Hi. It seems to me that there's an issue with Black Islam, at least considering its optics and its legacy in the US, having to do with dissent, being engrossed in a tradition of dissent. When you think of people who are famous Black Muslims, I think of Muhammad Ali, I think of Malcolm X, I think of Yasin Bey, all people who are vocal about empire and, you know, connections between Black solidarity movements and Palestinian solidarity movements, for example. And it seems to me that like that legacy, in order for it to experience the same level of care that, say, immigrant Muslim communities experience as sort of like the American dream chasing docile immigrants, it would need to liberalize into like a palatable narrative. So I guess I feel that that's a paradox, and I'm wondering if you know of an exit to that paradox, or if it's a paradox at all to you. And this is a question, I guess, for Muna and Dr. Suad. I suppose, yeah, sorry, my bad. Does there exist a paradox for Black Muslims as far as being integrated into a palatable identity segment to the nation state?
So I guess in terms of the first question around the Nation of Islam and problem or not, I think that I know what you mean in terms of people people sort of having concerns around sort of orthodoxy and what people believe and that kind of thing. I think, of course, part of what's happening there is that people aren't actually paying attention to the Nation of Islam, which is a space and a community, a Muslim community that has a important history, but also an important present, right? In which these questions are questions that they are also sort of grappling with, sort of within their community as well, right? So this is not, so that's one thing, right? So I think one issue is just that, not having that kind of familiarity, so you don't really know, you just assume that it's this. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is, but in terms of this question of in the way, I actually don't think that's in the way. I think, you know, Muslims, the same Muslim who will say, I can't get down with the nation because of X, Y, or Z, will, you know, go to an interfaith brunch, right, with the Baptist church around the corner, or the Catholics, or the Jews, or the Hindus, or the Buddhists, and I'm like, I don't, so you know, I mean, so it's kind of like, so if you can make those kind of relationships with people who aren't Muslim, then what is preventing you from having those kinds of relationships with people who are, right? And so I think, so something else is going on here, right? I think, you know, in that sense. So I don't think the nation is the problem, right? I think it's the kind of how some Muslim communities select which sort of issues become the issues that are the most important or significant to whether or not you can be in community with someone else. Other questions? I forgot the liberal one. There's another one. Oh, inside the community. Yes, right. So, sorry, and I'm just gonna, and people can respond too, but I'll respond, and maybe it wasn't articulated really clearly, but the point of Muslim Cool is it contests anti-blackness in the Muslim community and outside of it, right? And so, like I was saying with the Muslim dandies, they are sort of confronting and challenging notions of black men as thugs, but also challenging notions of black Muslim practice as religiously suspect, as the idea that the only way, I call it the politics of pious respectability. So the only way you can be sort of pious is if you can perform a particular kind of Muslimness that is non-black, right? So this is what's happening. I think, so I talk about that. I also talk about the ways in which, you know, I have a chapter on policing blackness. This was the whole devaluation or disavowal, instrumentalization. And so the ways in which sort of the assertions of hip hop music and using hip hop music and putting hip hop music in Muslim spaces to push back against the ways blackness is policed. The argument being that, you know, for people who don't have a problem with music, so those who don't know, and like in many religious traditions, music is one of these things people disagree on whether or not it's sort of permissible or not. But for people who are not, don't have that debate, whether like music is cool, they're still treating music differently depending on where they come from. And so part of what Muslim Cool is saying, well, no, this hip hop. So I talk about this one piece called Turntable Liquor, and the way in which this one artist, it's like it's a set, it's a crew, they were doing it. And it's basically, you talked about sampling, so this idea of using he uses like Moroccan Ganawa, which is a spiritual music. He uses Qawwali from the South Asia, and different things, hip hop, and sort of scratches it. It's like a DJ, it's a turntable set, right? You know, that is meant to be spiritual. This is the point, right? And so those kind of creating something like that and bringing that into a Muslim space precisely to push back on this kind of the ways in which blackness is policed.
Hello? Yeah. Kind of just to hop on what you were saying, how I dismantle, how I talk about my identity within my community is really, by talking about it, by challenging my friends, by, you know, like you guys see I'm wearing a do-rag. Like if we walk outside right now, you can see 5 people wearing a do-rag, probably going to be a black person, and that's representing the hip-hop culture. And then I'm also Jamaican, you know, like we talk about being a diaspora, and I figured, well, I want to cover my hair, and I don't really want to wear a hijab because it's not something that I identify with anymore. So how do I do that? Well, I integrate all the personalities of me, which is a little bit of hip hop, a little bit of diaspora from Jamaica, a little bit of who I am in general. Like my grandma loved wearing pearls, and I'm a pearl girl now, and that's just kind of like tying that all together. And then I started talking about it, and so when someone said, "Hey, you have that like cute do-rag on," I'm like, "Oh, actually, you know, it's just like a way how I express myself and how I be free." So I think that's how I dismantle it, by challenging my friends, by talking to my peers, and respecting the differences with myself and with others.
I think I'll say like a little bit relating to like my personal experience and relating to the community. I think especially looking at a technique like turntabling or DJing or sampling, our generation, people here who have grown up here, we are people who are both intimately familiar from having grown up hearing the Quran or listening to Qawwali music or listening to other forms of music, you know, in the Islamic world. And we are also people who are intimately familiar with new techniques and modern techniques like sampling and like DJing and turntabling. If it's not us who put the two together to try and find a form that resonates with people and that brings our culture and our religious experience into the new fold, somebody else is going to do it. And we generally don't like it when they do it because they don't ask and they don't know what's up. They just think, that sounds cool. I'm going to drop that in my set. I'm not sure if anybody heard, but I think it was a few months ago in the spring. This guy, DJ Dax, he's a British DJ. I'm not sure his origins, but he dropped the azan in a DJ set in Algeria, or it might have been Tunisia. But that's like okay, we've got Turntable Dicker on one side, and then we've got some guy from the UK who just drops the azan in the middle of a set, and you can listen to it too. Go online, type in DJ Dax, azan, Tunisia, and it's terrible. It's like the worst top 10 EDM beats with the azan just shoved in between. And you can tell, like, the audience is still kind of moving, but you can tell people are like, oh man, this guy is about to get it after this. So in terms of like dealing with our own communities and dealing with these things that we've inherited and like these new techniques, it's like, it's on us and we've got to do it. And yeah, maybe your parents are going to get pissed. Maybe the people in the mosque are going to get pissed. But it's like, it's yours. And we have to own it, and we have to own our space and and everything that we've inherited, and assert that this is something legitimate, and we are the people that are going to make it. So.
Oh, the palatable question? Yeah, okay. So that was the one I was going to respond to. I think that palatable is like such an interesting word. I am the daughter of like Black immigrants who kind of bought into like that whole situation, and let me tell you, it's not like, it's fake news. Like, it doesn't work. So you know, I think, you know, the structure of white supremacy is a behemoth. It's just like massive. I think that as a Black person and as a Black Muslim, you can be desired. You can be, like, people can mine from what you're doing, but I don't think you won't ever be palatable in the sense that people will want you for you, if that makes sense. So I think, yes, you will always be outside. And I don't like people like Muhammad Ali or Mos Def are like massively popular. So it's like this, it is like a paradox. You're massively popular, but you never will be on the same level in a way. You're always going to be outside, and they're always going to be kind of mining from you and thinking about you in the abstract sort of cultural or aesthetic realm, but you'll never be like a real person that will be like, you know, next to somebody, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I would agree with that. I think, you know, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, you know, and their popularity, I think, because people, they sort of don't take them as a complete, right? So, you know, someone was telling me that I think for Muhammad Ali, like the rights, I guess, to use his name have been bought or sold or something like that. Some company owns them, like 80% of the rights, something like that. And they never mentioned that he was Muslim, for example, like ever, you know, which is, it's Muhammad Ali. I mean, the reason why Muhammad Ali is even important is because of how he said what he did, because he's like, I'm a Muslim, you know, so like, and I'm a Black man, like this, like, so it's like, it's really ironic. He's like, how does that work? But, you know, so this kind of whitewashing that happens, right? I think so. I think so that happens, and so they're popular to people because people find something in them that they like, but they don't necessarily take the whole person, which is, I think, what she's saying. And so that's true for these kind of really influential people, but I think it also can be true for everyday folks as well. And so I think the question isn't about how or when Black Muslims can integrate into sort of non-Black Muslim sort of broader communities. I think the question is, when are perhaps non-Black Muslims going to be able to identify that what they're doing, like she says, is fake news, and that our survival depends on sort of releasing yourself of chasing after something that is not meant for you, and coming back home, I should guess, you know. So, yeah.
I think this, if I understand the question correctly, and like how you're using this notion of palatability, I feel like when it comes up and South Asian or Arab Muslims bring it up and bring up this history that you know, Black Muslims have here, I have a very simple question, which is where has that aspiration to palatability gotten us? Where has it gotten us in terms of, yes, we are going to colleges and believed to become engineers and scientists. When stuff really hits the fan, where has that gotten us? And in that regard, I kind of come back to what I was saying originally, which is that I don't even think in this regard of the real fights that are happening right now, it should be on the same stage. It's Black Muslims have been facing way more and for way longer, to the point that maybe they should be at the front and directing and advising rather than the other way around, which happens in so many of these mosques and so many of these movements. And just looking at the South Asian community, it's like, look at who are our best examples of like aspirational whiteness. You've got our Nikki Haley's and we've got our Bobby Jindals, who are like the highest elected officials. Like, forget their name, forget like their religion, forget anything. Like, they seem to not. I don't even. How much have they spoken up when a Sikh man has been killed for being mistaken to be Muslim? How much have they spoken up when Indian Muslims who are here have been assaulted by the police? If that's where our palatability aspiration is going to get us, then I'm sorry. When it really hits the fan, you were asking for it. Or rather, you weren't asking for anything. You just waited until it all came apart.
Yeah, okay. I think we're gonna wrap there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you.